best new writing out of Africa and from the African diaspora here. And we hope as many of you as possible will come and participate in that. We also have a regular series of business lectures, of book launches, and parties, especially parties. We culminated last year with our 120th anniversary celebration gala, which was, I think, I can say in all modesty, the best party involving Africa in the UK last year. And we look forward to welcoming you to our future parties. But not today. Today is not a party. Today is a serious discussion of Africa in 2023. We are bursting with questions about what is going to happen. There is climate, conflicts, elections, economies, and culture and creativity. And we hope over the course of the next hour and a half to cover all those things. We have a fantastic panel to offer you their thoughts on this. And I will therefore hand over straight away to Patrick Smith, who some of you may know. He's an old friend of the Society. He's also a long-standing editor of Africa Confidential, which is the most astute, the most insightful, and the best informed of all the magazines commenting on Africa, and of which you can, a rare opportunity, pick up a free copy of the latest one outside. If you didn't pick one up on the way in, pick one up on the way out, because they cost a lot of money if you actually want to buy them. But they're brilliant, and I'm sure they offer a student discount if you want to get one before. And Patrick knows everybody across Africa. If you're in African politics, if he doesn't have your phone number, you don't matter at all. So, Patrick.
I wish it was true.
Over to you, and thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Nick. Welcome, everybody, on this frosty evening in London. Purpose of the evening is to try to spot some trends, get a sense of what could go right and what could go wrong, and the context in which those developments are going to unfurl in Africa this year. I think, judging from all the international commentary at the beginning of the year, it was something of a gloom fest. I think the managing director of the IMF said that there's a high probability that a third of the world would go into recession by the end of this year. We've already seen reports from the ratings agencies, and more of that later, about growing debt crises and finance challenges across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. To some people, that sounds a bit like the replay of the awful 1980s and 1990s, when the IMF and the World Bank reigned supreme and was jetting around the world, dispensing their strategies for economic reform and market economics and so on. So that's on the economic side. We've also got about a dozen elections ahead of us. The biggest election, measured purely statistically in terms of the number of registered voters, and that's 93 million registered voters, is in Nigeria. And I was actually chatting to the Nigerian election chief last week, who'd recently been in Washington, and surprised some of his diplomatic audience there with the observation that Nigeria is actually the second biggest presidential democracy in the world. Because, of course, India has a democracy under Modi. It was a debatable argument, I know. But Modi, of course, is prime minister, as is the Indonesian system. It's a prime ministerial system. So Nigeria is the second biggest presidential system in the world, federal state, very similar in structure to the US system. But the election is a very, very big deal. So we're going to be spending some time on what that election means in terms of policy, in terms of the candidates on offer, but particularly on the policies on offer, and what one candidate against another might mean. Other big elections coming up, Democratic Republic of Congo, or Congo-Kinshasa as we eccentrically call it in Africa Confidential. They're due to have an election this year. There is some doubt about whether the president, Felix Tshisekedi, will go ahead and organize that because he has been citing security worries and various other problems, logistical problems about the election. But again, that is, in a country with over 100 million people, that is another big statistical election, and significant, obviously, in terms of the economic weight of Congo, and particularly the bulk of its resources that the rest of the world is trying to get its hands on, particularly the industrialized countries, for the green energy transition, the cobalt, the lithium, and so on. The other important election is going to get some headlines, I would wager, would be Zimbabwe, which is likely to go to the polls in July or August, where the incumbent Emerson Mnangagwa is up against a newly energized opposition under Nelson Chamisa, which is already subject to some degree of legal and physical attack. So again, people are going to be watching that quite closely. Then a couple of also important elections in West Africa, Sierra Leone and Liberia, in the middle of the year, both where incumbent presidents are looking to get another 4 years in the job. And both started out with very strong promises on developmental finance. And certainly in Sierra Leone, they started delivering on education reform and the like, and then started getting hit by the financial realities from the end of the austerity period, the pandemic, and now we have the energy crisis. So there's a lot of political issues to talk about, and then we've also got joining us from Nairobi, Murithi Mutiga, who is a specialist on security. So he's going to be teasing out a lot of the security defense issues that come from this sort of economic background. So I should introduce the other three panelists. Razia Khan, sitting right next to me, is the head of Africa and Middle East economics in Standard Chartered Bank and wings around the world from her base in London. And is going to be addressing some of the macroeconomic issues and strategic issues that the economies face in various African countries. And as I said, we have Murithi Mutiga in Nairobi, who is the director, the African program director of the International Crisis Group. And also on the big screen there, we have Amaka Anku from Eurasia Group, who's a practice head and is a political risk specialist and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and all-round expert on the politics and economic developments in Africa coming up this year. And Maudou Diallo, we've been speaking before the program started, and you're between posts with the Boston Consulting Group and the Tony Blair Institute in Dubai, and you work a lot on political risk and climate finance, climate policy, and so forth. So welcome, everybody, and welcome to the panelists. Could we start with you, Razia, and maybe address some of these critical questions around the financial context? One question I want to ask, and I think quite a lot of people have been talking about it, is what is the nature of the financial challenges facing Africa at the moment? Is it a debt crisis, as the ratings agencies are telling us and the World Bank is telling us, or is it a revenue crisis, or is it a bit of both?
Thank you, Patrick. So there was no way we were going to start off with an easy question at all. And at the risk of sounding very gloomy, maybe I'll touch a little bit on how everyone was feeling about Africa's economic prospects towards the end of last year. This seems like a strange way of looking at what lies ahead in 2023, but the important development is that there's been quite a shift in the thinking about just how difficult and just how challenging it's going to be in the year ahead. So bear with me while I provide some context. Let's look back at Africa's economic performance in recent years. We know that since the softening of oil prices at the end of 2014, some might be tempted to say the collapse of oil prices with shale production in the US, it's been tough to generate significant African growth. 2015, 2016, weaker commodity prices, concerns about China's growth, EM debt crises in 2018, and then, of course, the impact of the COVID shock. Most African economies had not fully recovered from the impact of COVID. Some still had some degree of COVID-related restrictions. Some even had lockdowns of certain sectors when the world economy was once again hit by a new shock. We know that there had been a very unequal access to vaccines. Developed economies had better access, better supply, were able to reopen sooner, reopened with much more rapid growth than even policymakers had anticipated, and of course, much more rapid inflation. So the big news as we face 2023 is still the aftermath of what had happened, with policymakers across developed countries having to tighten policy rates, still having to tighten policy rates further in reaction to that inflation shock. Economic growth was stronger than many producers had anticipated, and this ironically did have a beneficial impact on many African economies, because even though many of the region's key economies were still trying to overcome the negative effects of COVID that we had seen in 2021, the fact that we did see this robust many African economies were able to grow their way to recovery, helped by what was going on in developed markets. But this was very quickly overtaken by the need for much more significant tightening than many market participants had anticipated. Towards the end of 2021, there was a belief that the Fed would roll back some of those COVID-era measures, that there would be some moderate rate tightening, that markets would have to get accustomed to that. No one thought we would be looking at a situation where inflation would get close to double digits or even in double digits in many of the developed economies. And in a sense, what we're seeing now, what we're still seeing, is the aftermath of that shock. For so many years after the global financial crisis, it was much easier for many African sovereigns to be able to tap international capital markets for the borrowing that they required, for domestic investment programs, for the capital expenditure that governments were rolling out. This was a borrowing-fueled boom for many countries. Yes, a lot more spending was enabled, but it was all done on the back of that easier borrowing because global conditions were accommodative and allowed for it. The shock that many more people are going to have to get used to now is not only have we seen the impact of that developed market tightening, exacerbated in some respects by the shocks also stemming from the Russia-Ukraine situation, higher food prices. We know food still dominates consumption baskets in Africa. And unlike the rest of the world, we can't assume that we've seen the end of that food crisis necessarily. But the real question, looking to 2023, is what is this tightening of global financial conditions going to mean for different African economies? We can't assume that just because markets are saying, well, inflation in the US looks as though it's peaked by the second half of this year, the Fed might even be cutting interest rates. We've probably seen the worst of the inflation shock. We're not going to be going back anytime soon to a world of super low interest rates. And to answer Patrick's question about what lies ahead, should we be more concerned about the likelihood of a debt crisis that keeps on growing? Or is it really a revenue crisis? Can African economies grow their way out of this? Can they adopt the right reforms? Well, a lot of this is going to hinge on precisely what happens with global financial conditions. It's worth mentioning the good news. When we started 2023, markets were generally rallying. This wasn't just because of the softer US inflation data that was being released. It wasn't just because of the perception that actually, as much as everyone was really worried about a developed market slowdown, maybe we were looking at only the likelihood of a mild recession, and this would be more easily overcome. It wasn't just the optimism with China's reopening, the zero COVID policies behind it. China might re-emerge as a much more significant engine of global growth. At Standard Chartered, we are very constructive on the kind of growth rates we will see with China's reopening this year, and there's no question that this will be having a beneficial impact on African economies. We expect much more significant trade gains in terms of China-Africa engagement than has been seen for a while. But the big uncertainty is this tightening of global financial conditions. We know that some countries already had difficulty with it. Last year, Ghana opting to default on its external debt commitments, leading to the sovereign credit rating downgrades that we now see in place. Ghana opting for the common framework to negotiate its debt, external debt with its creditors. And the question everyone asks is, are we going to be seeing many more examples of this across the region? Well, who's going to be next? A good scenario, a more positive scenario, which now looks to be in reach, is that actually markets which had been closed off to many African issuers for much of 2022 might be showing signs of improvement. It's still too early. We haven't had any significant sub-Saharan African issuance just yet, but we've started to see, with the more positive mood that has gripped markets since the start of the year, the expectation that there will be significant spread tightening, that this could continue for some time, that with continued adoption of reforms, some countries like Kenya that might have had difficulty refinancing their debt obligations might find that eventually markets reopen for them. When we're looking at who could issue in international capital markets, the usual names spring to mind. Oil prices are still very much supported, so Angola could do so should it wish. Nigeria, post-election, might still have significant access to markets. The Francophone economies that are seen to have been less adversely impacted by what happened last year are also seen as possible contenders. So the broad idea is that, no, we're not going to see country after country reeling over, and we're not necessarily going to see this building into a bigger debt crisis. But the way forward is going to be more difficult, because gone are the days of super low global interest rates. We are going to be seeing a reset of those interest rate expectations. Tighter policy is here to stay. Investors are going to be much more discriminating about the credit quality of sovereigns that they're investing in. And this is why the reform effort will matter a great deal. So I'm supposed to be leaving you with a few bullet points on what to expect. What are the key takeaways from 2023? No doubt we'll get to this in a lot of the discussion, but let's talk about the major economies. Nigeria, first of all. Elections front and center, very rightly, of what everyone is focusing on. There is a sense that whatever shifts we see in Nigeria, there's going to have to be the adoption of more meaningful reform. Fuel subsidy reform, there isn't an allocation for the fuel subsidy beyond the middle of the year, and it looks as though this time, with domestic refining capacity, things are finally in place for Nigeria to make that difference. Will it be accompanied by foreign exchange reform? Could Nigeria finally be in a more sustained growth path once again? South Africa, the other big economy, has been rocked by a power sector crisis that only seems to be deepening. South Africa's climate transition doesn't look to be as easy as might once have been assumed. There will be difficult decisions that have to be made in the coming weeks. But what we are seeing in South Africa is perhaps the adoption of reforms that take away from that overdependence on the state-owned utility. It opens the way for a lot more renewables to be made available. It might go slowly at first, and there are necessary bottlenecks, but this could be a big driver of overall growth, not in the near term, but in the years to come. In Kenya, elections last year were very meaningful. Everyone recognizes that global conditions are not going to be allowing Kenya to borrow its way to big spending projects as it did in the past. There's a crucial refinancing discussion to be had on the standard gauge railway, or rather, how does Kenya manage its external debt commitments? Does it sit down to negotiate just with China? Does it sit down with all creditors? This is still an open question. But in Kenya, there is also the belief, which we see reflected in the more forward-looking indicators, that if there is going to be the adoption of a bottom-up economic model, gone are the days of the big spending, but there's a lot that can be done to drive growth and to drive greater development, that Kenya too could possibly surprise more positively with its growth outcomes. So I'll conclude by saying we should not forget the global environment is difficult, but if anything, this is going to precipitate perhaps greater reform in the Africa region. Do we see a debt crisis developing? Not necessarily. Markets, forward-looking markets, are telling us that maybe we're over the worst of the shock. But this doesn't mean that the pressure to adopt more meaningful reform, to really focus on economic formalization, revenue mobilization, creating a healthier base for future growth, none of those pressures have necessarily faded. Still, where do we lean on this question? Somewhat more positively.
Well, thanks, Razia. That's a bit of a breath of optimism in a pretty frosty year otherwise. Can I just ask you one irritating question, trying to get you to respond to the tour of US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who has spent is spending no less than 10 days touring the African continent. Now, I'm sure it's nothing to do with US competition with China. Just so happens she always wanted to visit Senegal and Zambia and South Africa. But she's been there. And rather subtly, not saying that China is the big rival in Africa or anything like that, but just saying that China should be doing more on debt. She made that message loud and clear in Zambia, saying that there's this creditors committee which China co-chairs with France, and it's been doing absolutely zilch, or next to zilch, for the last 2 years, since Hakainde Hichilema won the presidential elections. And the economy is really being held back by obstruction of the creditors. So firstly, what is she doing in Zambia? Is she doing the right thing, or just pushing sort of US strategic interests? And do you think it's going to make a difference in what happens in Zambia? Is there now a really concerted international effort to deal with Zambia's terrible debt problem at the moment?
So this is a hugely interesting situation, and there's no doubt that Treasury Secretary Yellen's visit to the region has to do with that deepening of US ties. It's building on from developments at the end of last year, the Biden administration really wanting to have that outreach to African economies. Zambia, as we all know, is at a very interesting place in terms of its debt negotiations. To have been able to benefit, to get IMF Executive Board approval for its program, Zambia needed to obtain the assurances of different creditors, financing assurances from everyone, including China. But now comes the difficult task of translating that into the actual treatment of debt. Without getting too technical about this, Zambia has to make progress on the next step. Creditors have to say, if it's not going to be a principal haircut, if it's not an outright debt reduction, what are the other means that they could give the debt relief that Zambia is seeking? Very interestingly, there were comments on this from the head of the IMF also in Lusaka this morning, talking about the financing assurances already received from China. we should not forget that China, as a G20 country, is a signatory to the common framework. And this common framework, this means of trying to help countries that get into trouble with their sovereign debt obligations, trying to work towards a quick resolution of it, it's new and it's untested. The belief is that China, seeing itself as a developing country with developing country challenges, tends to favor either extending the maturities of the debt owed to it, reducing interest rates in some instances, over an outright principal reduction. But as any creditor knows, there are various ways to get at the necessary net present value reduction in debt that's being sought. So the IMF expressed optimism that maybe with all parties being convened, progress would be seen. The deadline for the first review is around the 1st of April this year. And the expectation is that there aren't necessarily any holdouts, that we will be seeing a lot of progress. Now, the key point is all parties involved in those debt negotiations realize that in some ways Zambia is seen as a test case for whether this can be done. The IMF has been speaking about convening a new grouping of creditors, recognizing that the old clubs, the Paris Club, doesn't necessarily represent all the interest, that new creditors have gotten involved in the process of this. A key test case, not just for Zambia, but for many African countries, is going to be how easy is it to achieve that creditor consensus to get quick results when countries do get into trouble with their external debt. So I would still lean to the side of being optimistic. I think it's too soon, given that we have seen in principle commitments from all of the key official creditors to Zambia that they're willing to give something to Zambia in the way of the debt treatment requested. I think it's just a matter of time, and we shouldn't be surprised if this takes a few weeks longer.
Great. Well, that's good news for Zambia, and much deserved, I think, given what the country's going through at the moment. Maudu, can I turn to you and take up some of the points that Razia raised about Nigeria and the elections there? You've been following it pretty closely. How important is it, do you think, for the state of the economy, stability of the country, who wins this presidential election next month? And then, of course, the subsequent gubernatorial elections in March.
Yeah, I mean, it's everything. It literally is. I'm not exaggerating when I say that this is the most important election in the world this year. Right. It's in a few years it'll be obvious. Yeah. In maybe 20 years it'll be even more obvious. But I'm here to tell you today. Right. That this is the election.
I hope everyone's noted that.
Right, like if
there's a UN demographic projection that makes Nigeria the third biggest country.
Yes, in the world. But
so
yes,
we
exactly.
should. Yeah, I know Howard French wrote this great piece in Foreign Policy,
exactly.
making that point.
Yeah.
Everyone's looking at Turkey. Well, Turkey's important in Europe, but Nigeria is important globally.
100%. And I think that same article actually I read as well points out that no matter what happens this year, Nigeria is still going to have, there's certain issues that the election isn't going to solve. They're very, and anyone who's been following sort of Buhari's time in office, sort of the last sort of 2 terms, it's very obvious that there's some really serious issues. Unemployment is at 33%. Poverty went up, insecurity went up. You also have went up. Depending on who you speak to and depending on who you speak to, its value in the last few years. So that's not a great mix. You don't have to be an economics PhD student or someone who lives in Nigeria to know that that's not a good thing. Now, coming to the election, I have, I promised myself that I wouldn't come here and sit on the fence about what's going to happen. The event is called Forecasts and what's the other word?
Crystal ball gazing.
Exactly. So I'm going to say who I think is going to win the election. I'm not Nigerian, although I have very strong interests in Nigeria for various reasons. But I think, I say that because I want to point out that I'm not affiliated to any party or anything like that. So when I say who's going to win, it's not because I want them to win, but because I think that's what's going to happen. Now, when you look at the voter registration, first and foremost, you'll find that, unfortunately, for the people who had this optimism about youth turnout and the rise of sort of the awakened Nigerian voter, unfortunately, the figures that I looked at this morning will tell you that voter registration among young people, defined as 18 to 35, is down since the last election. I'll say that again. For the young people who were expected to come out even more so this time than last time, the last time it was at 51% of the total registered voters were young people. This time it's about 43%. So that goes against the narrative that you've been hearing a lot in the media in the past few years that talks about how everything from SOAS to this very blatant and obvious problems around youth unemployment specifically. There's unemployment issues more broadly, but specifically among young people, will bring out young Nigerians in droves. And there was this whole push, a bunch of celebrities and musicians and influencers got involved trying to get young people to register to vote, and there's this PVC movement. I shouldn't say unfortunately, because it did bring out a lot of people to vote. I mean, the number is still significant. However, it's not what people expected. Now, when you couple that with the fact that, not just Nigeria, but generally elections in Africa require a huge amount of infrastructure on the ground. It's very, very difficult to have a Macron-type insurgency, independent candidate that comes out of nowhere and wins an election. I'll tell you why. And for all the people here who are very familiar with how elections are run, I apologize for wasting your time for the next 30 seconds. I promise I'll try and give that to you somehow at some point. But just quickly, in some places, information reaches, very slowly. It takes time. And the easiest way to do that is to have people in those places. Now, when people think about a lot of African countries, they think it's small, it's easy to get around. Between road infrastructure and everything else, and just pure distance, Nigeria is huge. It is huge. I can't stress this enough. And it's very difficult to get around. Most people fly from state to state or city to city. That's how big it is. So it helps to have people within your party in those places constantly driving your message and reminding people this is who you need to vote for. Now, if you're a relatively under-resourced and new party or candidate like Peter Obi, it's very difficult to actually have that same infrastructure. You can't build it overnight. These are very deep, very entrenched systems and infrastructure, both in terms of people and structures, buildings that have been there for years, that make it difficult to compete with the two major parties. Now, aside from all of that, when you take that point and add it to the fact that, the way in which people vote as well is something that can't be ignored, right? We would all like to think that democracies are places where, we all line up the candidates and look at their manifestos, and whoever has the best manifesto we vote for, and then they become president. Amazing. Yes, we can. No, we can't. Unfortunately, what actually happens is, I'm just throwing out random numbers here, but 70% of the time, people vote based on who they think looks nicer, who their parents voted for, who has the same religion, the same beliefs, not necessarily economic or political, but social, right? So the problem you have there is, even though when I read Peter Obi's manifesto, I think, fantastic, this is great. And certainly if I was a young Nigerian with my PVC, I'd probably vote for him. However, most people don't read the manifesto. even if they did, they would still feel as though what's more important to them is the leader of the country needs to believe in what I believe in, needs to come from the area that I come from, or at least have supported things in the areas that I come from, et cetera, et cetera. So when you put all of that together, my prediction, well, actually, no, I should talk about why Tinubu can't win either. So I've talked about why Peter Obi can't win. We can go into detail about that, and I'm sure people disagree with that, and that's fine. That's why we're here. But I'll talk about why I think it'll be very difficult for Tinubu to win. Now, in the states that Buhari's won over the last two elections, people assume that those states are just going to vote for Tinubu because Tinubu's now the candidate of the same party. That's not true. Like I just pointed out, a lot of people in those states, the major states, the ones that have a lot of voters, for example, the 3Ks as I call them, Katsina, Kano, and Kaduna, alone have 14 million votes between those three states. Those states all voted for Buhari twice over the last two elections. My strong belief is that they will vote for Atiku this time. Again, that's why we're here. It's fine to disagree. And I look at Amaka when I say this. But I believe that they will vote for Atiku this time. And that goes to Atiku's record in the area and things like that. And then also you have the issue of Tinubu being a bit unorthodox. He's a southern, he's a Muslim, but from the southern part of Nigeria, and he's also Yoruba. So for a lot of people in the north, particularly in northern Muslims, are finding it very difficult to make out what to make of him. You know, he's Muslim, but he's not from the same area as us. Can we trust him? You know, so again, everything that I'm saying is not is from speaking to people on the ground. I know a huge amount of people who are working in sort of election centers, pollsters, et cetera, and even though Peter Obi's ahead in the polls, that's to be taken with a pinch of Gary, because honestly, the truth is that at the same time, in 2019, there was a poll that had Atiku up by 23 points against Buhari. We all know how that turned out. No spoiler alert here, right? So I say that what people need to be looking at is the fact that you have a candidate in Atiku who, to me, might end up being sort of like a Joe Biden in a way, and I'll explain why. People might not see him as their first choice, but they might end up voting for him because he's familiar. This is his 6th time running. He knows the game inside out. He has the resources. He has a well-established party. The PDP is actually more well-established than the APC, surprisingly to a lot of people. They have very strategic strongholds that will be very important in this election. And his running mate is the current governor of Delta State and very popular in the Southeast, which is going to be an important area of the country to keep a hold of in the next election. I could go on and on. I have a whole sort of my notes on my phone here is just brimming with the reasons why. But my prediction is that, contrary to pollsters, Peter Obi will be lucky to get more than 10% in the election and probably win. He'd be lucky to win more than 3 states. My other prediction is that Atiku will win the presidential election this year, and Tinubu obviously will be close second. I'll leave on that mini bombshell.
Yeah, I mean, definitely we want to interrogate that a bit. Just one question. If you think Obi is going to get 10% of the vote, he's going to take that from PDP areas, isn't he? He's going to take it from Southeast and perhaps the South-South.
Yes.
And that's going to help Tinubu and punish Atiku, right?
You would think so. But the problem is there's going to be a complete rewriting of the electoral map, I believe, in the next election, where states, as I mentioned, the Kadunas, the Katsinas, and so on, that have huge numbers of people registering. And actually, ironically, when you look at the youth registration numbers, Lagos actually scored the lowest at 29% of registered voters in Lagos are young people. I would have expected that to be much higher. In the north, in the northern states, the states that I mentioned, you actually have 49, 51% of registered voters being young people, right? And so you have new voters coming in who will be looking at Atiku as someone who they can sort of rally around. And I believe that there will be a complete shifting. But the numbers that Obi's going to win by in those couple of states that I think he's going to win isn't going to be as high as people think. So you'll still have a lot of people in those states voting for PDP because, one, PDP's had a stronghold in that area for a very long time, including, going to Goodluck Jonathan days and so on, but also because they've had a huge infrastructure and sort of and a history of winning governor races, which I didn't talk about, but that's a very, very important aspect of Nigerian elections. Who is the governor of a state? And I laugh because this is sort of the underbelly of elections in Nigeria. But the governor of a state, depending on how rural or remote the state is, could oftentimes choose their results, right? So if and I know INEC's sort of doing a lot to sort of change that and have a more centralized system. But that, not only because of the sort of more, I guess physical aspect of actually sort of tampering with ballots or whatever, but just because when people have a governor that they know and trust in that area and sort of you've built that traction with voters, it's a lot easier to convince them to vote for someone. And I think Atiku choosing the governor of Delta State as his running mate was a stroke of genius, in my opinion, particularly to sort of outflank the Obi insurgency.
Okay. One more question before we go to the next speaker. You're moving to Dubai for your next escale in your career, which is UAE is hosting COP, UN Climate Summit, COP28.
Sure.
Couple of questions off the back of that. The head of the Abu Dhabi oil company has been selected himself, I'm not quite sure how this works, as president of COP28, and some climate activists have pointed out, surely some mistake here, a bit of a contradiction. A guy who's made an awful lot of money and helped his country make an awful lot of money out of fossil fuels is now telling us to go green. So perhaps you could explain that.
Sure.
And also interrogate perhaps the really jarring Western hypocrisy, and I think it's probably at its worst in Europe, but still pretty bad in the US as well. Well, we've got to get the world off fossil fuels. So, in case you were thinking about developing your oil and gas and trying to develop your economies on the back of that energy system and the export revenues, forget it. Just put up those solar panels and those windmills, and you'll be fine. But you're not going to pollute the world like we did. And I wonder how you think those arguments are going to play out at COP28, when you have actually one thing I guess the activists would say is positive in the sense that we know all about fossil fuels in the Middle East. I mean, that's, there's no secrets there.
So I got so excited about that second question that I might forget the first one.
Please,
so
I think you ought to.
I'll start with the first one.
Before you go to Dubai.
Yeah, I'll start with the first one. So yes, his appointment was met with, in some, spaces, with excitement. In other spaces with sort of almost a nod of agreement, but not necessarily excitement. And then in other places, outrage, to be fair. I think I'll skip over the outrage because we all know why people are outraged. He's the head of the oil company and so on, and people think it's a bit of a joke. However, I tend to, when I saw it, my genuine reaction was sort of a nod of agreement, not excitement, but agreement, because I think that in order for, and this isn't just about climate, it's all the major issues that we face globally. In order to solve these issues, you can't have, Greta and a bunch of other activists sitting in a conference and saying, yes, we all agree on this, let's all do it. Well, you're leaving out all the important people who actually need to be transitioning away from. It's easy for you to say you're going to do X or you're going to do Y because you don't have billions of dollars invested in it. You don't have shareholders that you have to worry about. You don't have a country that is based on the extraction and exploitation and sale of fossil fuels. So it's easy to agree on these things when you're not, you don't have sort of that baggage, holding you. So I think the inclusion of people such as the head of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, and others, and the CEOs of Chevron and ExxonMobil and so on, is crucial to these discussions. You simply can't leave them out. And I think the appointment of someone like him, who's well respected in that community, and also a lot of people talked about the fact that he's the head of the oil company, but they don't talk about the fact that he's also sort of a leader of the renewable energy movement in the UAE. He heads up Mazda. Mazda is a free zone in the UAE, which is dedicated to the development and innovation around renewable energy. And if any country I can sort of give the benefit of the doubt to, maybe I'm saying this because they just gave me a visa 2 days ago, but if any country I can vouch for and sort of give the benefit of the doubt, I honestly think it's the UAE, because they put their money where their mouth is. And as we talked about earlier, putting money where their mouth is. And as we talked about earlier, putting $2 billion in investment in Zambia for renewable energy, but also in the UAE, they put tens of billions of dollars into sort of transitioning and doing it seriously, not just talking about it, but actually doing it on the ground. So that's my take on that. On the second point about the West and their hypocrisy, and I think SOAS is an appropriate venue to have this discussion. But I think the key thing there is look, I think it's almost, a lot of Africans and myself included sometimes find it insulting that countries will say, well, we have industrialized and developed over the last, how many sort of years, and we've seen the benefits of it. Our people live in relative prosperity and security, and mortality rates are low and so on. And that is all, I believe, on the back of having an industrialized economy, that sort of these excesses that are generated and profits are reinvested into, so on and so forth. If anyone wants to read up on the benefits of industrial policy, please do. But that's what I'm referring to here. Now, you can't then turn around and say, well, we've benefited from it, but we think you guys would be better off actually. I think your rainforest looks really nice and it traps a lot of carbon. Why don't we pay you, which is a real idea that was talked about at COP meetings, why don't we pay you X amount of money to keep your rainforests the way they are and not develop and not build factories and not provide sort of these jobs that could come from these factories for your people, but rather just keep things the way they are. Frankly, I think that's insulting. Some people have championed it, frankly, because I think they want the money. But for me, as someone who fundamentally believes in the fact that we not only need to industrialize as a matter of wanting to, but as a sort of necessity, because we're never going to solve the issues, the core issues around education, health, poverty, and just being self-sufficient. Look at the issues around getting vaccines to our own people on the continent. Those issues are going to be solved by having proper industrialized economies on the continent, and we can't do that with the current framework. I'm not saying that we need to pollute too. It's not a tit-for-tat game where it's like, oh, well, we're going to pollute as well. That's not the point. The point is that we need to have the policy space and the capital support, both private and public, to be able to build industries in a greener, more efficient way, but build it we must.
Great. Thanks for laying that on the line. I'd like to turn to Murithi now, who's been waiting very patiently the other end of the computer terminal in Nairobi. Going on from that, Murithi, the Horn of Africa is undergoing the worst droughts, they say, for 4 decades. That's particularly bad in Somalia, and I know you, in your former job, you were specialist on the Horn. I'm wondering what connections you draw with the climate crisis in Somalia and the Horn in general with the security situation. What are the links between the two things, particularly what's been happening in Somalia over the past year? And I think growing pressure on the government to declare it a famine so you get the international system searches for its conscience and ships some much needed help over?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. I know I'll be quite brief because I know everyone has been very patient and I'm keeping you away from your after session drinks. But, well, I think the situation is really gloomy. It's very, very tough, especially in Somalia. We've been having a chat about it, and we hear a lot about a cost of living crisis in parts of the West, but there they face a cost of survival crisis. If you look at it, the COVID pandemic had a particular effect on the most important industry in Somalia. Somalia is the #1 exporter of live animals in the world. They tend to have one big payday every year, which is the Hajj and exporting to Saudi Arabia during the Muslim festival. But COVID happened, those markets were closed. Suddenly, everybody could not really get their large payday in Somalia. And layered on top of that, you then had a couple of months later, the war in Ukraine, which could not have been worse timed. It sent prices up. And of course, on top of that, you then have the huge climatic shocks. You have the fact that they're encountering one of the worst droughts, as you described, veering towards famine by most accounts. And so it's really, really concerning. I think it's one of the most important facets of this that we need to watch across the continent is the level of displacement that's occurring as a result. But even having said all that, there's still slivers of good news. We saw in Somalia a very difficult election that still passed off relatively smoothly. The elites there have found a way to manage elections, even in circumstances where people think that they might tip over the cliff. And next door to Somalia, very importantly, Ethiopia, which is the country that generally in the past has exported peace in the region. It's encountered, suffered through one of the most gruesome wars, even by the standards of the Horn, it's really been quite shocking. And so it's a huge relief that has quietened down somewhat. Happy to take follow-up questions on it. It's still very tenuous. It's still very difficult when you have a war that's fought at such a cost. It leaves a lot of wounds and it leaves a lot of, resentment and anxieties. But at least it's quietened down now. And we hope that it will hold the peace agreement there.
If I could follow up on the peace deal, or ceasefire deal, followed hopefully by a sustainable peace deal. This is the most murderous war on the globe, yeah? I mean, some of the figures, Obasanjo came out with 600,000 people killed. That's certainly a lot higher than Ukraine. And I think, speaking as a journalist, it's time for a mea culpa. I think we've devoted as an organization of people around the world, as journalists, devoted perhaps 1% of the energy we put into covering the war of Ukraine to Ethiopia. So it's a huge disgrace. And I'm just wondering whether that disgrace will also be reflected in the international support for the peace process. A UN monitoring system. As far as I understand, the deal that was signed last October in South Africa didn't bring the international system in full-throated in the UN sense with a peace monitoring system, a full-on demobilization and reintegration of forces program. That seems to be being worked out a bit on the hoof. And I just wonder if you think the resources are there, the personnel is there to run that program, to really give the peace process a sporting chance of succeeding.
So this was essentially an internationalized civil war. I use the word in past tense very cautiously. We really hope that the worst is behind us, but it's a war also driven by grievance. And one of the things that stands out is that the combatants were, to a very significant degree, ordinary people, farmers and traders and others that took up arms in a part of the Horn that's particularly rocked by very deep historical grievances. It's certainly unfortunate that it didn't receive the level of attention that it deserved. And one hopes that that will change now in terms of the support that's given to the cessation of hostilities and the tenuous agreement that we see being built now. I think what's important is that it appears that both the authorities in Addis and the authorities in the Tigray region, capital of Mekele, have made a strategic choice that they were essentially fighting a lose-lose war, that none of them could really win sustainably. I think despite the disgraceful choice by all sides to go to war, and we have to remember that all of them had a chance to avert this conflict, I think it's important that they didn't try and settle this in the typical Ethiopian fashion. You know, it's a very martial culture, and I hate to essentialize, but it's very rare that war ends in an agreement. And so that gives a chance to at least build on something. It's great that they pulled back from the brink, despite the awful cost we've seen already. But within the region, there's anxiety about the motivations of the players in choosing this path. I think there's a worry that a lot of them see it in a negative sense that, you know, on the Addis front, let's keep our war alliance going, but then let's add the Tigrayans and find a way, you know, to also keep every actor off balance. And then for the Tigrayans, some would say that, you know, the gamble is maybe if we come into the tent that we might fracture this alliance that has been so destructive to us. Of course, Patrick, as you know, the elephant in the room is Eritrea. You know, very small country, small population, exercises outsized influence within the region. Many would say has behaved in a disgraceful fashion in the course of the conflict. But, you know, in a sense, it's very hard to read what Asmara thinks of the agreement, whether they really support it in any sense that, you know, is really full-throated. I think what's important now is to support efforts, including in the region, including by the Kenyan president, William Ruto, to find a way to create a new compact for peace in the Horn of Africa, which suggests that you don't have a peace agreement that people see as a war pact against them. And so what's happened too often in the past is that every agreement has had winners and losers. The Ethiopia-Eritrea agreement froze out the Tigrayans. Now that this agreement really should try and not freeze out actors, and the Sudanese have come into the picture. They've improved relations between Khartoum and Addis. I think that's really good grounds to build upon, but you have to be very cautious about whether to be fully optimistic or not.
Could I ask you on Sudan, could I ask you how you see 2023 for the Sudanese revolution? 2019, in a way, what happened there, the ousting of the Bashir regime, in many ways looks like a prototype for what's happening in Iran at the moment. It was a revolution led by young women with growing national support from the regions, but it succeeded in toppling the Bashir regime, which was then supplanted by the military. But there are these talks going on now between the military and the civilian players on a constitution and a transition plan to elections. Are you hopeful about that? Is it going to deliver something? Do you think these current talks?
So taking a step back, Patrick, I think overall across the continent, I see at least three sources of optimism. One is that, you know, despite this very vicious civil wars, despite the fact that, you know, the transition in Sudan is still stilted, breakdowns in governance in the Sahel, we actually don't see interstate wars, which is, you know, a big advance from the 90s. I think the second thing, of course, the quietening down of the war in Ethiopia, and then the agency of the youth, which is really critical. And I think Sudan is the shining example of this. Very few of us gave them a chance when they started rallying, you know, initially in quite small numbers, but eventually in such huge numbers in a very diverse fashion across the breadth of Sudan, and succeeded against all odds in essentially forcing a coup that toppled Bashir. I think what strikes you when you engage with the Sudanese, travel there, is that everybody is talking about the future. Everybody is talking about what they want to see coming next. And essentially there's a chasm that's impossible to bridge between the desires of the youth and the capacity to govern by essentially the military and the security forces. And over the past year, despite the coup, the youth have triumphed. They have stayed on the street at very high cost, and they have an agreement now to try and fashion a civilian government. The military may not really believe in it, but it's a reflection of the fact that the security forces could not pull off, essentially as an Egypt and just crush the protest movement and govern without broadening the tent. So I think there is hope in Sudan. I think the protest movement also needs to be careful. Crisis Group issued a statement just this morning, essentially saying that this is the only deal in town. And while it may not be perfect, it certainly needs to be made more inclusive, but the protest movement also needs to grasp what it can get, try and build up on it, and then you really need external support to the economy, which didn't come quickly enough when Prime Minister Hamdok formed the first civilian-led government. I think that's really critical at this point. But the agency of the youth, not just in Sudan, but elsewhere, I think is a good news story, and it's something to build upon.
Great. Last question, right across the other side of the continent. So this week started with the announcement of the Burkinabe junta bidding adieu to Emmanuel Macron and the French forces. That follows hard on the heels of the Assimi Goïta junta in Mali doing the same thing a year earlier. France is certainly having a bad time in West Africa at the moment. It's being rejected politically by this sort of activist groups, but also by the juntas, certainly in Burkina, Guinea, and Mali. And in walks one Prigozhin, Vladimir Putin's chef, so-called, whose sideline is running a mercenary army called the Wagner Group. And they've been installed in Mali for the last, 18 months or so. They're now spreading their wings. They're actually in Sudan, they're in Centrafrique, they're apparently showing their faces in Burkina and beyond, and Libya too. So how seriously do you take a crisis group, what appears to be the replacement of French military muscle by this sort of mercenary outfit led by Evgeny Prigozhin? Is it sustainable? Is it making any difference to the core security issue, which is the insurgency in Mali and Burkina Faso, led by a group of Islamist militants?
I hate to end on a gloomy note, but the prospects in the Sahel in the year ahead are not very bright. I think, unlike, potentially in Ethiopia, the deal might hold. Potentially in Sudan, a concrete deal might materialize. But I'm afraid things will get worse before they get better in the Sahel. I think there are two separate issues. One is that first, we see a breakdown in governance. And we see a context in which you don't really have institutions or elites that can actually pull off a deal that really stabilizes the situation in concrete terms, because the conflict has gone on for so long that you have such a diffusion in terms of the actors that are leading those armed groups, in terms of their motivations, and a very weak response by the state. You see frightening figures, 10% of the population in Burkina Faso displaced, almost a third of the territory under the control of the armed groups. I think in this context, that local context is what's most important. And actually the contest between the French and the Russians it grabs the headlines, but it's peripheral. It's peripheral to the real core collapse in governance in a lot of those states, in the failure of the state to deliver services to rural people who are then liable to have their territories taken over by armed groups that offer limited services. I think what we've seen in terms of the coups in the Sahel. They're driven by desperation. These are countries that were never particularly wealthy, but people could go about their business. They could go to their farms, they could go to weddings, and now you can't just hop on a motorbike in rural Burkinabe or Mali and go where you want in many rural areas. So I think what we need to address is the failure of the military-centric approach, driven not only by the French, but now taken over to a certain degree by the Russians. It will not succeed. It has not worked over the last decade. And I think what's really important is a major rethink, and that's been the central crisis group policy point, that you need a shift in approach that emphasizes potential talks with armed groups, which is controversial, but necessary, because a lot of those armed groups are driven by local concerns, even where they wear the cloak of global jihad or whatever. If you can build up local ceasefires, build the space to improve governance, to deliver more, especially to populations in rural areas. This is very hard work, and we don't underestimate how hard it's going to be, nor do we dismiss the need to a certain degree to confront some armed groups militarily. But the military-centric approach has failed, where the French, and it has to be said, they failed quite comprehensively. The Russians are not likely to succeed either, despite what they say at the moment. And I think what's needed is a very, very difficult effort to build up the state and make sure it can proffer services to the greatest number of citizens.
Great, well, thanks. I'm not totally pessimistic in the sense you're identifying what's going wrong as the Europeans screw it up again. Amaka, thanks. First of all, you win the ultimate prize of patience and for bearing with us, but I know you've got some very strong views about all the things we've discussed. Can I start with a sort of geopolitical question? You're sitting in Washington, D.C., and you're in the belly of the beast, so to speak. The geopolitical crisis is heating up. Now, Janet Yellen, we discussed earlier, is bombing around Africa at the moment. And one of the things she told the World Bank, I think it's fair to say, instructed the World Bank to come up with a reform of the institution, more in keeping with the times of the financial pressures put on Africa and other developing regions, more flexible on the amount of money available. She particularly had in mind the climate transition funds and all the rest of it. It's said, and I don't know whether you've had a sneak preview, but I think certain insiders in Washington have seen the World Bank management's plan to reform the institution. They're going to sort of lay it out publicly, I think, at the spring meetings in April, and the IMF is going through a similar process. So we've got American support for reforming the IMF and the World Bank, and we've also got American and Chinese and now European support for getting an African permanent seat at the UN Security Council. We've also, that same group of countries, also supporting an African Union seat on the G20. If you put all these things together, do you see really important shifts in the international system that could play to Africa's advantage this year? Or is this just a bit of sort of geopolitical publicity seeking and diplomacy one-upmanship? How seriously do you take it?
I mean, I think they are important gestures, but they're not going to change the reality on the ground for most African citizens, right? I think, so I think that's all fine. That's all good. It's helpful to get a seat at the table. But what's ultimately going to make a difference for African countries in terms of driving economic transformation are some of the things Muriti was talking about and Raza was talking about earlier. You need to focus on raising domestic revenue, right? Financing is by far, in my view, I think it's the biggest challenge for most African countries, especially in the ones in the West, South, East. Most of them, if you look at tax to GDP ratios, is well below the OECD average. You cannot do the things you need to do to create a competitive economy without financing, right? Without building your roads and your bridges and your rail and ensuring that people have access to electricity. All of that is going to need financing, right? So I think Yellen's visit and the seat in the G20, and that's all great, but ultimately what's going to move the needle is actual concrete financing prospects, whether it's through the private markets or through, bilateral sources or through domestic sources, right? That's what's going to move the needle to make the investments required to create a competitive economies across the region.
I mean, do you think the current challenges require a radical revision of development finance thinking, strategy, and so on? I mean, you mentioned about raising revenues. It's incredibly hard. I mean, Nigeria, I think 5% of GDP, revenue is 5% of GDP, amongst the lowest, lower than Saudi Arabia.
No.
I mean, how do you get from there to something like the Asian average of early 30%? I mean, obviously not.
I mean, for Nigeria, it's simple. It's a political problem, right? Nigeria has never even tried. Let's be fair. Nigeria has never actually tried to collect taxes in any serious way because they had oil revenue. And even though oil revenue isn't, I mean, if you think about Nigeria's oil revenue per capita, Nigeria is not oil rich, right? You can't compare Nigeria to Saudi Arabia or Qatar or the Gulf oil rich countries because they have a lot fewer people. But I do think for a country like Nigeria and for many other countries, I would say for many other countries, it's more complicated because you have large informal sectors and you get to a point where it's a lot harder to raise your revenue. For Nigeria, the low-hanging fruit, it's really, really low-hanging fruit, and it's a political problem, right? Which I do think that I agree with Hamad. I agree with the gentleman who spoke earlier about this being an important election. Yeah, I mean, absolutely, it's an extremely important election, and this is one of the things we're looking at, which we can talk about, right? Which is on the good news side, all of the three major candidates for the first time in the Nigerian election are all promising to remove subsidies. Okay, that's a big deal, and that's good news. Okay, all three of them are promising to remove subsidies. All three of them, I think that I think you have a bit more of a very different outcome when it comes to revenue generation, because that has not been a focus of either Atiku or Obi's campaign. Right? Obi's campaign has focused a lot more on cutting waste, which I think is a little bit, it's slightly, in my view, it's slightly misguided, because even if you cut all of Nigeria's government expenditure, which is, the federal government expenditure is 6% of GDP, if you cut the whole thing out, right, you still have no money. If you just stop paying every federal government employee, you still have no money to make investments in roads, right? So I think the focus needs to be on generating more revenue rather than cutting waste. Yes, there's some rationalization you could do, but that's not the problem, right? So I think that's where outcomes might vary, and I think that's something that Nigerian, I hope the Nigerian electorate will force the candidates to focus more on.
You mentioned revenue and incentives. Bola Tinubu ran Lagos State government. He also apparently ran something called Alpha Beta Consulting Company, whose MD has alternately sort of damned him and praised him. But I mean, the theory of that seemed to be that this consulting company, with very strong political ties to the Lagos State government under Tinubu, collected massive amounts of revenue from citizens of Lagos State, but took quite a bit for themselves. When it comes to running the federation, do you think that approach is possible, could work, is ethical? I mean, just almost parceling it out to some sort of private sector outfit.
No, you can't do that. No. I mean, I think one thing that has been clear over the past 5 years, and that the FIRS, the Federal Inland Revenue Service, does not get enough credit for. There have been a lot of reforms at the Federal Inland Revenue Service. They just announced, for example, record tax collection in a period of very slow economic growth. That is good progress, right? I think Nigeria gets, one of the problems at Nigeria today, and again, I think it's a problem of the current leadership, is that the current leadership does not make an effort to frame the narrative. There's no real effort to offer a positive vision for the future. And so you have the narrative is framed by basically the opposition and sometimes extremists, right? So I do think that there is a credible, right now, there is good progress in strengthening the capacity at the federal revenue, tax revenue, and I think it will be very hard to hijack that, right? What the next government needs to do is to build on that progress and improve it, and actually take a much more engaged effort. I think the current administration has not invested the necessary effort, has not invested the necessary political capital, in part because a lot of people who don't pay taxes are politicians, they're colleagues, right? And so it takes political capital to really and truly focus on closing the gaps and generating that revenue, and that's something that hopefully the next administration will put the political capital and the necessary engagement behind that.
From what you've seen of the candidates so far in the election, which ones do you think have got the better set of policies and more likely to pull Nigeria out of the financial problems it faces? I'm not going to ask you how you vote, but if you've been a vote.
So I've said, I mean, we've kind of answered. So let me say this. I think that the candidates actually vary very little on actual substance. And if you're listening to them on the campaign trail, it's very hard to tell where they differ. They're all saying the same things, okay? I think that where they will differ is in implementation, okay? I think that implementation risks differ. I think that somebody like Peter Obi, for example, will face more serious governance risks because as somebody who, if he wins as the, anti-establishment candidate and who is unlikely to have a majority in parliament, for example, that could be a challenge that he would have to work through, right? Working through a new political party and building elite consensus, extremely important to run Nigeria, right? Will be a challenge that he has to work through. I think that if the ruling party's candidate wins, that he will also face a challenge of an extremely uninspired citizen class, right? And a citizen class that is extremely disillusioned and really wants change, right? And will feel cheated in some ways because they'll be stuck with this incumbent. And I think that honestly also applies for Atiku, right? I think that will be a challenge that he also faces if he were to win, because both he and Tinubu represent Nigeria's political establishment, which a lot of Nigerians are kind of rebelling against. And so if he was to win, he would also face a challenge of sort of rebuilding trust that the political establishment can actually deliver social services, can actually deliver investment in infrastructure and growth, right? So the other thing I would say is that for the first time, in my view, for the first time in Nigeria, we're likely to see at least, people can argue about this in terms of the population and the different, how different elections were manipulated or not. But this is the first time where you will have the winner of the election likely be the minorities candidate, okay? Because since 1999, every election, at least on paper, has been won with over 50% of the vote. Because you have, in my view, a three-horse race, extremely close, extremely competitive. I disagree a little bit with Maud that Peter Obi, it will be lucky if he gets 10%. I do think he will do well in this election, right? And what that means is that you're likely to have, the winner be, in Nigeria, you don't need to get 50% of the vote. If you can win with 35% of the vote, you can win with under 40% of the vote, as long as you meet the threshold, okay? And so that creates a challenge for that winner to really and truly invest in creating a narrative and driving social buy-in across the political ally, across the country, from the various interest groups, and really building a momentum that Nigerians can feel like they're a part of. That's really going to be critical in terms of then getting down all the other reforms that we know Nigeria needs to do, removing subsidies, generating revenue, and avoiding the debt crisis.
Right, thanks. just last bit in this section, I just wanted to ask you about what's going on the other end of the continent in South Africa. Ramaphosa has just been elected, second term as president of the ANC. He's gearing up for the general election next year, presidential election next year. Meanwhile, he's got this mother of all energy crises. He's got Janet Yellen in town. I think she's talking to him tomorrow. And a very difficult transition out of coal to renewables. And this just energy transition deal that South Africa has been negotiating on and off for now like 18 months without huge progress, it seems. What's your sense of where South Africa's heading? Is it going to make the necessary reforms to get out of this? Is Ramaphosa in one bound free? Now he doesn't have to stand for election again in the ANC. Can he do what he wants?
It's a good question. And I do think this is a big question for South Africa in 2023, because there's a general election in 2024, which has been, there's a lot of speculation around whether the ANC can maintain control of the central government. Can it win more than 50% of the vote so that it can form a government without needing a coalition? And this is the year, this is a decisive year. And I think the problem is, look, I think, Ramaphosa, yes, he won the leadership of the ANC, the ruling party, in a much stronger position than he did 5 years ago. He has more allies in the top 7. He has more allies in the NEC. But he is still Ramaphosa. He is still a guy who likes to be extremely deliberative, likes to rule by consensus, and likes to bring people along. And he still has this, fraud allegations about what happened on his farm hanging over his head for at least probably the first half of this year, as the investigations continue at the central bank and by the Hawks. So I do think, look, I think the key, I don't know, I don't have a crystal ball, I don't know the answer to this question, but I would say what I am watching for is how aggressive and how decisive he is when he does a cabinet reshuffle, right? Who does he bring in? Will it be Gwede Mantashe still at Energy Ministry, who, of course, if he's there, we will continue to see a very, very, very slow progress in terms of the energy transition, right? Will it be somebody else? So I do think who he appoints into the cabinet is going to be a critical factor. And then ultimately, to your question, will there, I think it's a matter of, I do think that however it turns out, I find it hard to believe that we're all of a sudden going to kick off and things will start going much faster, right? It's going to continue to be a painfully slow process, in part because of the structure of South Africa's economy, right? Like, it's going to be really hard. You have the majority of your population that are locked out of access to financing, right? So it's going to be painfully slow, and it really just needs extremely technocratic people at the top to help make this, I guess, as quick as it can be, even though it's not going to be very, very, very quick, regardless.
Great. Well, so things to watch out are reshuffle. We've got State of a Nation address next month, I guess, and then budget. So a lot of things going down in South Africa. I think this is the moment where you are free to pepper the experts with your questions, disagreements, and substantive points, but no speeches, please. Can you give your name and what institution, organization you're from, please? Thanks very much. Sure.
Hello? There we go.
Yeah, loud and clear.
Hi, good evening, all of you. Thanks for your comments. I really enjoyed the panel session. I am Tiger Bajo. I'm also at Standard Chartered in the Sustainable Finance function based in London. I have two questions. The first is a how, and the second is a what do you predict, and the how will go to Mado. And this is more about the decarbonization effort across Africa. I think we've all noticed in the past couple of years, or now at this present moment, there is a renewed drive towards the developing the refining potential across Africa, both in oil, sugar, in Nigeria, Angola, where else. But at the moment, the world is moving away from fossil fuel, and we've seen the technological revolution come and pass us by, both in computers, mobile phones. Are we going to see this new transition revolution come and pass us by while we're still stuck in fossil fuels? And how does Africa navigate that in terms of making sure that we can still drive revenue growth but not be left behind? My second question is a what do you predict? And this will go to Razia. And this question is regarding what we see in the global economy going on right now with the decoupling of different continents and different global powers. We're seeing an era of deglobalization. And I want to ask you, how does Africa navigate that deglobalization? And what countries do you think are most at risk of being stranded or of being isolated as a result of this deglobalization?
Great questions. Thanks. Should we take about 2 or 3 questions at a bash?
Hi, over here.
Sorry.
No problem. Hey, my name is Kamaria. I am from Ethiopia, an international development consultant working on refugees, migration, and a former employee of the AU. I was just touching up on when we talk about the prospects for the continent, and I know a lot of you touched up on the economy, finances, and generating revenue. And I was just wondering if you can touch up and probably discuss on how important the African continental free trade is for the continent coming into 2023. It was something that came out of the interest in trying to boost the intra-Africa trade, and yet we saw the Africa-US summit last year that the African continent and the AU had signed an MOU agreement with the US trying to boost trade between the two continents. And I think there was a promise of around 55 billion to Africa within the next couple of years. So does that take away from the African member states' commitment to the intra-Africa, to the CFTA, given the fact that it was promised on to boost inter-Africa trade within the continent in itself? But now with this deal coming in, does that mean, we will see countries moving away from that commitment and continuing on with their Western relations, or does that still focus, or does that help still focus within the continent in itself? That was one question. And my second question was maybe to you, Razi. In regarding to Ethiopia and the fact that it's now moved to a post-conflict situation with the TPLF and the Tigray conflict and the agreement. As of, I think, last year, if I remember correctly, the inflation rate for Ethiopia stood at around 35 point something. And then currently, I think a couple of weeks ago, they managed to report and say the inflation rate has somewhat calmed down to 33 point something, and that the prospect of Ethiopia's economy is looking great for the foreseeable future. But as an Ethiopian citizen myself, I'll tell you that is not the case. Food is highly still very expensive in the country. The insecurities from water, power, all of that still consists and continues to grow. And with, I think, the Ethiopian finance minister's current restriction on certain exports into the country and the lack of foreign currency in the country, it's just all piles up. So I was hoping if you can also touch up on what you think the forecast for Ethiopia's inflation situation is in the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Okay. Gentleman right in the center there in the grey suit.
Hello. Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Ibrahim El-Damfa, London School of Economics. My question goes to Amaka, I think that's her name correctly. You just mentioned the importance of African Union sits in the G20, considering this overarching support by the superpowers for AU sits in G20. I am not trying to sound a little bit pessimist, but considering how AU is funded, 61% more is like external partners, and like 30 something plus is within the AU, And that is something plus, considering the realities on the ground, you know it's also from external partners. Do we really come to the terms that this is just a mere legitimacy seeking, or is it, to be honest, that AU is going to make impact? Because we're not seeing anyone saying no to AU seats in G20. So who and what will AU stand for in G20? Is it for Africa or for those supporting it? I mean, it's a little vague, but not trying to be pessimistic, but trying to be a little bit realistic. Thank you so much.
Good, thanks.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, this is Gospel from Nigeria. I'm an economist. I was just going to ask a couple of questions. First of all, to Razia, please. Prior to the pandemic, nobody ever believed that a non-economic variable would lead to a global recession. All right, and 2020 taught us that a global health challenge can lead to a global recession. Same also the context of inflation we deal with today. We talk about the Russian-Ukraine war, COVID-19, climate change, and the likes. So my big ticket question is, what's the future of monetary policy instruments like interest rates or fiscal policy instruments in navigating economic crisis, especially in the context of globalization? Second question is, for Razia, Maslow, and Namaka, how realistically can Nigeria achieve, apologies if I didn't mention the name correctly, how realistically are reforms in Nigeria? Because it's a subject I've talked about several times. I've worked in policy forums where we talk about reforms very largely, but how realistic is reforms in the context of the current political landscape right now, regardless of who wins the elections? I personally have read through the manifesto and the three manifestos, and one of the major things I've seen that lacks across board is a clear mechanism around the how. You know, you want to create 3 million jobs in a year. How do you plan to do that? You know, what are your top priority sectors to drive all that? And also, how do we lead reforms within the current political landscape in Nigeria? And then lastly, we talk heavily around removing subsidy in Nigeria, but from my own analysis, I think it has more root causal conversation than just subsidy itself. 60% of household income goes to not just food only, but also fuel and PMS consumption, you know, due to the fact that you have a lack of power in the region, as well as a lot of small businesses who fund generators and the likes to run their businesses. If you if you improve on local refineries and local PMS production, I think we're going to kill demand by half. And we can begin to talk about the subsidy conversation in context to what makes sense. So my big question is this. Even if subsidy were taken away, do you think that that would really fix the core of the challenge, which is a power crisis or an energy crisis in the region? Thank you.
Okay, great. I think we'll stop there with the questions and get some answers. And going through the list, we've got 8 questions here. Actually, the first one is almost circular. Yeah, Maudo, it's for you. Refining oil in Africa and the question of the phasing of the kind of the processing transition. You know, is it just that Africa is arriving at that policy too late? The refining of oil and gas and other products. Did Africa miss the industrialization boat, or where are we heading?
I think there's a risk. The premise of that question, there's a risk of assuming that all late industrializers industrialized in accordance with, some sort of a time period that was conducive for them to industrialize, right? So I would say that there isn't. Yes, it would be good to sort of ride that wave, but that shouldn't mean that we should put our hands up and say we've missed it. So so be it. Because as I mentioned earlier, this isn't a nice to have; it's an imperative. If the question is more of how do we not get left behind? Yeah. Okay. So to answer that question, I think the key thing is, if you look at the way people are talking about how to grow their economies, how to build resilience and so on, I'm really pleased to see that on the global stage with major policymakers and even financiers and so on, the conversation around industrial policy is back, and that creates a policy space for African governments to say, well, actually, to address this and to make sure we don't get left behind. The key is to ensure that we have a sensible green, if you will, industrial policy that addresses the key bottlenecks through a process of intentional and active policy making, as opposed to leaving it solely to the private sector. I'm not saying that the private sector doesn't have a role, of course it does, but I think we've seen how when we leave these things to the market, especially in African countries, it's not always apparent to them what the benefits will be for them, and oftentimes getting that financing right and aligning that financing between sort of the foreign investors and the local needs is almost impossible, right? So what you need to do is industrial policy is almost seen as impossible until it's inevitable, right? It's that thing, for China, a lot of people thought it was impossible for many years, and then it happened, and they were like, well, it was inevitable. They have all these people, they have all these resources. But until it happened, it seemed impossible. So what I would urge, if I was speaking to, and I have in the past, sort of if I was advising governments on the continent, my constant plea is for them to take this issue seriously and start to sort of build their ideas around this issue of industrial policy. Because that's the only way that you can say, well, we need to do X, Y, and Z in 30 years and actually put policies in place to achieve it. Otherwise, you're at the mercy of the market and what they feel they want to do in your country or not, right? Obviously, you need to align it with the interests of the market in order to attract financing and do it in a sustainable way. However, you can't leave it to them to do it for you. You need to essentially build that policy and then go out to them and align it with their interests and then get the financing, right? And on that point, I just want to give you a quick anecdote, right? At WEF, I was watching this panel. It was fantastic with Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Larry Fink from BlackRock and others. And God bless it, the head of the WTO is sitting there talking about the opportunities and so on that exist in developing countries and emerging markets, and talks about Africa and talks about how it's really important, blah, 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 and urges the panel to think about that the same way. Minutes later, Larry Fink talks about where he sees opportunities. Larry Fink is the CEO of BlackRock. He's one of the most powerful men in the world because he controls trillions? Is that correct? High billions, though, of dollars in assets. And he mentioned the places where he saw opportunities and didn't mention Africa, right? Because, and you can't blame him. You can't, because when he looks at his portfolio, or when he talks to people, they're not talking about opportunities in Africa, right? So what we need to do is make it make sense, speak to people like Razia, find out how it makes sense, right? And align that, and then take it out to investors and say, look, we've talked to people, we know what works, this works, we've seen it, we've done the numbers, we've done the modeling, it works. Do you want to invest? Please invest, right? It's a much better way of doing it than just hoping that people come and see the promise that you have and talking about how we're a continent of potential and resources. We've done that for decades and it hasn't worked.
Who did you want your second question to be directed to? To Razia. And that was deglobalization. How's it going? It was oh. Okay.
So great.
Do all the questions in one go.
Great question, and I'll try to do this in about 2 minutes to keep everyone's attention. So the wonderful thing about the deglobalization question is we had an Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement question, and one kind of answers the other. We know that one of the big threats facing the world economy, it's not just this tightening of global financial conditions that we've seen that everyone will have to navigate through, but what is going to happen to that key engine of global growth, the globalization, all of the productivity gains, all of the welfare gains that we all enjoyed to some extent because of the process of globalization? Has that consensus broken down? Are we going to see more fragmentation? This is where the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement becomes that much more important. Now, I have to say that a lot of the time I've been on the more skeptical side. 5 years to dismantle 90% of the tariff barriers that exist. We'll probably see a lot of the progress at the back end of those 5 years. Let's not forget that this came into operation when a lot of the land borders were physically closed because of COVID, just highlighting the extent of the shock. But we also know that Africa as a region trades the least amount with itself. Intra-regional trade is the lowest of any developing region. And this has got to be the big opportunity for lifting economic prospects, for lifting growth, lifting prosperity in the region. African countries trading more with themselves. But the hard reality is it's not going to be easy. Look at where the major infrastructure exists to enable trade. It's Africa with the rest of the world. Look at how global financial conditions have tightened. Where is the funding for that enabling infrastructure for greater intra-regional trade going to come from? The reality is it's going to be very difficult. There was a question also about whether the focus, the recent US-Africa summit, does it take away the momentum from the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement? I don't believe it's a zero-sum issue. I think African countries can trade as much with the rest of the world as they can try to build on that trade intra-regionally. East Africa provides a great example of what could be done in the recent past. If you look at how Kenya's trade patterns had shifted and how it became a much more important partner to regional countries. But no one should think it's going to be easy when the trade complementarities for intra-regional trade don't necessarily exist, and this is something that will require a great deal more policy attention. Very briefly, there were questions on Ethiopia. Is inflation going to come down very nicely? Will foreign exchange availability, which has been a problem for decades, suddenly resolve itself? Probably not. The bad news for Africa is, as much as we've seen global food prices likely to start going into global food inflation goes into negative territory. Part of it is just the base effect from the Russia invasion of Ukraine last year. In Africa, that's not necessarily going to carry through into a much easier food inflation environment. This is the reality. There were other problems last year. The strength of the dollar, the weakening of local exchange rates, the pass-through of those effects on inflation, the other frictions that exist, the extent we had our colleague from the crisis group talking about this, how conflict might have exacerbated that. You can't wish those issues away. Great question on Nigeria and the future of monetary policy instruments. I could keep you here for a whole half hour to talk about what might have gone wrong with the operation of those instruments. The problem is that Nigeria is probably going to have to be forced to use only the instruments that it has. And we all know that during recent years of weaker than usual oil production, a lot lower oil revenue, everything else that had gone wrong, all the challenges the country faced, there isn't going to be a lot of room for fiscal policy to provide any meaningful stimulus. Nor is there, with a 20% plus inflation rate, exacerbated by the climate challenges, exacerbated by the recent flooding, going to be much room for much easier monetary policy either. Nigeria will have to reassure in its embrace of reform. It will need to make itself attractive once again for international capital to come in, and that means most likely the adoption of more orthodox economic policy, including monetary policy. But I'll leave my comments there. I'm sure Amaka has quite a lot more to add on reforms. My final comment on the reform issue in Nigeria would be actually any of the candidates that comes in as president will likely have to be more reformist, not just because of what they've put in their electoral campaigns, on their platforms already, but because Nigeria has reached the point where it's just not possible to continue with an unaffordable regressive fuel subsidy, It's not possible to continue with the constraints that the current fixed exchange rate regime have imposed on the economy. And this is why we think that with few alternatives to reform, the likelihood is that we will see more reform.
Great. Thanks, Razia. Amaka, there's a couple of questions requires your expertise. The first one was this one about the G20. You said great, the externalities of Africa getting the African Union getting a seat at the G20, more representation in the UN, all looks good, but it doesn't actually make much difference on the ground. What do you think of the state of the AU at the moment? They're about to have their annual heads of state meeting and so on. I mean, perhaps where would you like to see it going? I think that was the thrust of the question. How can it change things? And what is it going to what is it going to add to the G20 in terms of the discussions? How's it going to steer them?
Yeah, so let me just say before I start that I will have to jump off after this, so I will try and do the other question on Nigeria reform.
Sure.
But I think the person who asked the question agrees broadly with me. I mean, I agree broadly with them that AU membership in the G20 isn't going to change, isn't going to sort of create economic transformation, right, in and of itself. I think what it does do is give AU a seat at the table with sort of other important, where it can then advocate for some of those other things that African countries need. I take the point about AU's financing coming from external sources. I would say, though, that over the past few years, I think the AU has shown that it can really drive consensus on key issues, right? The African Continental Free Trade Agreement was one of the fastest negotiated trade agreement in the world, just in terms of how quickly from when they started talking about it to getting ratification to getting operation. So yes, there are problems, and also during COVID in 2020. AU was one of the African region was one of the most organized in terms of actually getting together to acquire vaccines, pooling vaccines, distributing. So for all of its faults, I think the AU has shown in recent years that it can be a force for much more stronger coordination. I think the one thing that I would love to see the AU do more of is really figure out a way to tackle what is becoming an existential crisis in the Sahel, which Mauricio was talking about earlier. I think that there's been a step towards it with the AU standby force. I think that's something that the AU could really, bring, I would say, some positive momentum to. If we could have something kind of like what the role Nigeria played in West Africa with ECOMOG during the 1990s. On Nigeria, how realistic is reform in Nigeria? I think the one thing that I think people underestimate when it comes to reform in Nigeria, because there's a lot of sort of, what's the word I would say? There's a lot of very optimistic thinking about reform, outside, you come in, you change the system. The reality everywhere in the world is that reform is extremely difficult. It's extremely messy, and it requires, an economic transformation by itself creates dislocations. And so there's always going to be interest in the society that kick against it, okay? And so I say that to say, what you really need, you need first to build an elite consensus. It needs to be in the interest of the elite to do the reform that it is that you want to do. One of the ways to do that I think is extremely underappreciated in Nigeria is communication, right? Like you have to actually articulate a clear, positive vision and drive consensus around it, okay? And that you have to keep repeating it. It has to be clear. People have to see something in it for themselves. And that's how you're going to get sort of real reform done. When, things like revenue generation, it has been done. It has been done in some states, right? I think people will criticize Lagos for being, there's all these excuses for why maybe Lagos's experience is not the same as other states in the country. What I will say is that there are other states. I think Kano, for example, is a state that has a lot of historical advantages and does not live up to that potential, right? And I say Lagos because Lagos has managed to create a certain level of elite consensus where people are bought into a certain vision for Lagos, and they've managed to keep building slowly towards that vision. And I think that's the kind of thing we need to do at the national level. And I think, a long time ago, when Lagos first started sort of collecting more taxes, it required them to communicate. Citizens could call up at any time and get information about where the tax money was going. They built trusts, right? So that's the kind of thing we really need to see the federal government do, is really invest in communicating, building trust, and showing exactly where the money is going. Then you can raise more money, you can make the investments, and it becomes a virtuous cycle. So yes, reform is realistic. It requires an extremely savvy politician, and it requires elite consensus building.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. Marithi, can I ask you one about the Ethiopian economic situation? I mean, more than inflation, but just how you see that state of the economy at the end of the war. People are talking about devaluation, I think, for the first time in history, almost, perhaps. It's certainly always held up quite strongly against the dollar. And then the bigger question, following on from Amaka, on the African Union role, because the African Union was lambasted for not doing nearly enough on Ethiopia. Was that unrealistic? Of course, in the end, they took the credit for negotiating the peace deal.
Yeah, I mean, those are good questions. And I'll just say on the African Union that it's really a study in contrasts. On the one hand, the African Union has never been as needed as it is today. And as Amaka said, it has done some things quite well, especially on COVID and the free trade agreement. And, in the end, who else could have convened talks that all the Ethiopian parties could agree to? So it has the convening power, unique convening power, and ability to marshal countries on the continent that others don't. But at the same time, it's plodding, it's slow. Some would say it has management issues, it has leadership issues. You have divided member states. You have member states that are very domestically preoccupied. Nigeria being, a proper giant that in the past would be very assertive, very, very domestically preoccupied. South Africa very busy at home, and Algeria and Egypt divided quite acutely on the major issues. So it's an organization that's really needed, that will have to step up some more, especially in a world where you have great power competition. People are very busy elsewhere. And so the AU will need to step up. It will need to step up in the DRC, which we haven't discussed too much. But, for example, the UN mission there has run its course. Where is the African Union response to step in? The East African forces coming in, but in a quite haphazard way without organization and coherent leadership. So the AU needs to step up. It's very needed, but it's not nearly in the right shape to handle a lot of these crises. On Ethiopia, I think one of the most interesting and curious questions that will be answered in the weeks and months and years ahead will be whether the authorities will actually move quite rapidly towards privatization, some say even liberalization. There is very intense debate. People underestimate the level of ideological debate in Ethiopia. And some are quite wedded to the state-led model. We see a new nominee to head the National Bank of Ethiopia, Mamo Miretu, who has a background in the international financial institutions, who might be minded to speed up the path towards reform. I think one of the intriguing things about Ethiopia is that, yes, you saw a lot of technocratic, state-led development, but not enough trust in the private sector, but also a deep skepticism of the private sector and of international finance. So it's a great debate that will take place. My money would be on them maybe heading towards the direction of greater opening up of the markets, But as Razia said, you can't just walk away from a war that's been so destructive, that has run a slice through the value of the currency, that has limited investment and finance. It won't be easy, but it will be quite striking to watch. And as your questioner rightly pointed out, people are paying a very heavy price in terms of the ordinary standard of living for normal people.
Brilliant. Asante Sana, Muriti. I fear we have to bring matters to a close. I know that the brilliant panel we have, the two resident brilliant panelists, are only too eager to answer extremely long and detailed questions now, face-to-face, in person. I know Amaka had a pressing engagement to go to. Muriti, I know it's getting quite late in Nairobi. So thanks so much for your really eloquent and analytical assessment of what's in store for 2023, and a real mixture, but really well explained to the audience. All the best in the year ahead, and keeping us informed about what's going on, the Horn, the Sahel, right across the continent. It's a really incredible organization. Always worth reading their reports. So thanks so much, Muriti. See you soon, I hope. Just a thanks to Razia.
Thank you very much.
Font of economic and statistical and financial wisdom, and who has always resisted the temptation to start her own consultancy company and make billions, and so, which is very good. And so while she's here, explaining the financial and economic world to us. And Maudou, thanks very much. Great, and best of luck as you transition yourself from the cold climes of WC1 to the slightly hotter climes of Dubai. But I'm told it's still very clement there at this point of view. So great perceptive analysis of energy transitions and hypocrisy and a lot of other things. Thanks, most of all, thanks to you for coming and coming up with these brilliant questions. I just wish we had more time. And I'm sure there will be a few future spots, and indeed, I'm sure Razia and Maudou only too willing to take your questions now face to face. Thanks a lot. Oh no, what was